Josh here, and welcome to part 5 of my Rocky-thon. In this, I'll review Rocky 5. Now, I know that Rocky 5 is the most maligned of the Rocky series, but honestly, as anyone who has listened to my Rocky 4 review could probably guess, I do not think so. I think 4 is the low point of the series, and while this really only ranks above 4, I do think there is some merit in this entry. I didn't hate it. I think it's in fact quite a bit less silly than the 4th one. Granted, there are some incredibly cliche plot devices, but overall, I do think the movie works to a certain extent. So to start off, this movie takes place, yet again, right after Rocky 4, where Rocky announces he's going into retirement, and soon finds out that there is physical complications because of his previous bout with Ivan Drago. Now, really, the movie, it has this one plot twist early on that sends Rocky back to his roots, really. He moves back to Philadelphia to a smaller home, and it's just really him trying to cope with this change. And I really liked this story direction above all else in this movie. It's fascinating to see the change back. You can really tell that the director, John Avildsen, returning from the first Rocky, is trying to really get Rocky back to his roots, which I'm not surprised after Rocky went into the stratosphere in number 4. And I apologize, by the way. I realize I am being really hard on number 4. It's not that I hate the movie, I just don't like it, and I'm sorry. I really can't change anything about that. Anyway, like I said, the story here is really interesting on a conceptual level, I think. I think the biggest problem this movie has is the execution and a really weird climax. But, I really like that this movie tries to bring that nostalgic factor back in, because this was originally supposed to be the end of the series, and the return of composer Bill Conti really does help this as well, but I'll get more into that in a minute. I really enjoyed how this entry is kind of like a tour of all of the original Rocky locations, and you really get to see one really great flashback with Burgess Meredith, his last role in the series, that's really affecting. I think a lot of this movie is pretty affecting, and outside of a weird accent slip, I mean, he kind of seemed to drift into a more civilized speech patterns in the 3rd and 4th movies because he was starting to reading, I presume, but in this one he's back into kind of his Philly accent. I'm guessing that's just because you pick up accents where you go, so if you return there, he got his accent back. I don't know. Anyway, outside of that, I really enjoyed the story direction because it gives people a lot more to do. Sylvester Stallone gets a lot more chance to actually emote. Talia Shire really does a great job in this one. Again, it just has more to do. Even Burt Young, who really is, the least of the 3 actors, I think, in this entry, that is, does get a better arc than he has in the previous movies, especially number 4. I particularly like the kind of conceptual bent on this entry. Not only does it try to bring back that nostalgic factor to wrap up the series and bring it full circle, it kind of has Rocky taking over the role of Mickey and becoming a trainer himself, which I think is actually pretty fascinating, to be honest. I was really down for the movie for the most part. Unfortunately, there was a couple things that really do drag it down. Like I said before, the climax is ridiculous and really asks for too much of a suspension of disbelief, although there is some really cool editing regarding the physical complication. But it just seems really over the top, and it kind of ends without consequences that you'd expect would happen. But regardless of that, even then, there's the 2 main villains of this picture is really this new coach on the scene who is trying to get Rocky to battle this new champion, and he says no because he's retiring. And in the midst of Rocky training this, up-and-coming character from the streets, much like himself in the original movie, although kind of following a different path throughout, this trainer really gets him into his midst and pits him against Rocky, and tries to sour their relationship. And that I found really interesting in and of itself. Like I said, I don't think the payoff was very good, and I think the climax is more than a little ridiculous, but the concept itself was good. One thing I also need to point out about this movie is that Sylvester Stallone's, Rocky's son, gets a better arc here, and he's given much more to do. He really has a lot more screen time, and though his plot is very, cliche, stand up for yourself against bullies plotline, I found it somewhat touching, because while the kid isn't the best actor, he managed to get some emotion out of me. At least before he went to the whole, like, I'm an 80s rebel now with his earring, which I find actually pretty amusing in that Sylvester Stallone recognizes how ridiculous this is and adds a line into the script along the lines of, they're like, oh, you're the daughter I always wanted. Anyway. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it, and that played throughout the majority of the movie. And like I said, the really big problem I have with this movie is that execution. And those two actors, those two villains I was speaking of, they aren't really good. For one thing, the trainer is god awful. He reminds me of that lawyer from Seinfeld, except taking his role seriously, and that just doesn't work. He has the same mannerisms, though. I just was laughing every time he was on scene, particularly during his incredibly amusing reaction shots in the final fight. I can't help but feel that, too, by the way, I'm just intercutting here, that the climax could have been solved in a less violent means. I mean, I know it sounds funny coming from this is a Rocky movie, but at the same time, with the arc, the tone of the story is taking the arc that Rocky's going through, I felt that kind of non-committal, emotional climax would have been better than this kind of physical climax. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, especially if this was to be the end of the series. That said, I'm kind of glad it didn't end that way because it allowed for the excellent Rocky Balboa, Rocky 6, but that's for another review. Also, Tommy Gunn, who is kind of Rocky's trainer turned foe that I mentioned, really is annoying to watch. He's not that much of an actor. He's not like really god awful, but moreover, I just find him really annoying. His accent and his mannerisms just seem really obnoxious, and perhaps rightfully so to try and make him into more of a villain. But he just pissed me off when he was on screen, even before he turned into the villain. And I think that really hurt the film because it's asking you to sympathize with him to an extent, and I just couldn't do it. I didn't like the guy. Getting on, though, the effects in this film, again, boxing drama, not really huge amount of effects, but the cinematography does try and recreate a lot of the shots in the original Rocky, which I did find quite pleasing. Again, considering this movie is based a lot on nostalgia of the original movies, this worked quite well, I thought. And I did mention before that during the final fight, there's some really great, interesting montage-like sequences involving Rocky's physical complications that I thought were really cool, even if out of place. And otherwise, it's really not much to say about. I really have nothing more to comment on about it, honestly. It really wasn't spectacular. It didn't really stand out all that much, so I guess that's something to say for it. But at the same time, it didn't really impress me, so... The sound, like I mentioned before, Bill Conti does return here, and much to the benefit of the movie, I think, as much as I did enjoy some of the 80s songs in the fourth movie, it makes a lot more sense to have Bill Conti back for this, again, to bring the whole series full circle. It was nice to hear his tunes kind of coming back, and you can hear that music lightly playing in the background again. Really defines a lot of what Rocky is, I think, particularly the Gonna Fly Now song. Nice to see that return, and overall, I think Rocky 5 is a pretty decent movie. It has its problems, don't get me wrong, and it's not terribly involving as some of the other ones might be, or as fun as Rocky 3 might have been, but I think it definitely has its place, and it's a legitimate stepping stone to Rocky 6, which, like I said, more than makes up for the faults of any kind of story arc or plot arc. One thing I do have to mention, though, is I find it kind of odd how some subplots have been left behind in the series, and this is my rumination on the entire series, is that, like, what happened to Rocky's bad eye? Did he just get used to it? I mean, I guess I can take that. But then his physical complication in this one, that's never mentioned in the sixth one. And you'd think that'd be pretty fucking important considering what it is. But small quibbles, and not necessarily related to this movie. Seeing as this was supposed to be the end of the series, and the sixth one didn't come along for many a year. Like I said, though, don't believe what everyone says. I think Rocky 5 is a valid entry into the series, if flawed, but nonetheless, I think is worth watching.